What if I told you that tucked deep inside Grandma's kitchen drawer were recipes so bizarre, so jaw-droppingly strange, that even the boldest modern chefs wouldn't dare recreate them? This wasn't fine dining. This was wartime innovation, mid-century madness, grocery store survival turned into culinary science experiments. From meat molded in gelatin, to desserts made from canned soup, to dinners that combine ketchup, prunes, and powdered milk all in one pan. These recipes weren't written for luxury. They were born from ration stamps from the battlefield, from a 1950s obsession with what science can do to food. And tonight, we're opening the vault again. 10 more forgotten dishes. 10 more shocking food inventions. Each one weirder than the last. So grab your fork, brace your appetite, and hit that like button, because we're about to serve up another slice of America's forgotten food history. Sardine stuffed pickles, a salty secret from the pantry. In the days when refrigeration was a luxury and canned goods ruled the shelves, homemakers had to get inventive. One such invention, sardine stuffed pickles. It sounds like a prank, right? But this bizarre combo was proudly printed in mid-century church cookbooks and World War II homemaker pamphlets. Why? Because both ingredients were cheap, shelf-stable, and, believe it or not, considered nutritious. Picture this: a large dill pickle carefully hollowed out. Inside, a mashed mix of canned sardines, mayonnaise, chopped onion, and a touch of mustard is spooned in like gourmet pâté. Sometimes it was chilled and sliced into rounds for parties. Yes, parties. To modern taste buds, it might sound like a salt bomb. But back then, it was considered clever hosting. Sardines were high in protein and omega-3s, important in an era when meat was rationed or expensive. Pickles, on the other hand, added crunch and tang, a favorite of Depression-era palates who learned to love punchy, preserved flavors. This strange appetizer wasn't just about taste. It was about stretching ingredients, impressing guests, and proudly showing your resourcefulness. A woman who could turn a pantry item into a cocktail tray centerpiece? She was a homemaker hero. But like so many wartime recipes, sardine stuffed pickles didn't survive the rise of refrigeration and fresh produce. They slowly disappeared, laughed off as a weird phase in America's culinary past. Yet today, they remain a salty little time capsule, a glimpse into a kitchen that cooked with what it had, not what it wanted. So the next time someone jokes about vintage recipes being gross, remind them, this was survival, with style. Stay with us, because up next, we're diving into a gelatin recipe so strange, it made even 1950s housewives cringe. Lime cheese salad, when Jell-O met cheddar in mid-century mayhem. If you thought you'd seen the wildest side of vintage gelatin recipes, think again. Meet lime cheese salad, a glowing green, wobbly creation that once sat proudly at the center of 1950s dinner tables. It's not a joke. It's a real recipe that blended lime Jell-O, cream cheese, crushed pineapple, and chopped nuts into one jiggling, sweet, sour, savory mold. And yes, sometimes shredded cheddar cheese was added too. But why would anyone make such a thing? Well, back in post-war America, convenience was king, and Jell-O was seen as the glamorous answer to modern domestic life. It was shelf-stable, colorful, and moldable into any shape your heart desired. Home economists and food advertisers flooded magazines with salad recipes that stretched budgets, wowed guests, and, supposedly, satisfied every craving in one bite. The lime cheese salad was often served on lettuce leaves or with a dollop of mayo. For a generation that had lived through rationing, this was elegance. A way to show you'd made it, even if your salad jiggled like a carnival ride. To the modern palate, it's a Frankenstein of flavors, fruity, tangy, creamy, and nutty, all at once. But to 1950s homemakers, it was cutting edge, a party staple, a church supper must-have. And for kids, that neon green color meant something fun was on the plate. Over time, though, as tastes evolved and fresh produce became more available, recipes like lime cheese salad faded from favor. Today, it survives mostly in retro cookbooks and food history blogs, an oddball relic of a colorful culinary era. But in its day, this dish was the talk of the potluck table. Jelly bologna loaf, the forgotten Frankenstein of American lunches. Imagine slicing into a clear, jiggling loaf, only to find layers of bologna, hard-boiled eggs, olives, and pickles suspended like fossils in a transparent jelly. Sounds like a dare, right? But in mid-20th century America, this was a real recipe, the jelly bologna loaf. Born in the late 1940s and popularized through the 1950s, this bizarre creation was a product of two booming food trends: gelatin-based molds and processed meats. Housewives were encouraged to turn ordinary deli slices into glamorous luncheon centerpieces. The loaf was typically made with unflavored gelatin, sometimes mixed with consommé or vinegar, giving it that oddly savory wobble. And then came the layering. Circular bologna slices, chopped pimentos, celery, olives for color, and sometimes chunks of American cheese or eggs for texture. Once it was set, it was sliced and served cold, often with a side of mustard or on a bed of iceberg lettuce. Why do people make this? Well, during the post-war era, presentation mattered. Food companies like Knox Gelatin and Oscar Mayer pushed recipes like these in pamphlets and women's magazines, promising elegance, efficiency, and novelty. In a time when refrigerators were becoming mainstream and gelatin was a symbol of modern domestic science, this loaf actually felt fancy. But it wasn't just a visual stunt. These jellied meat dishes also stretched ingredients, stayed fresh longer, and impressed guests with their creativity. Today, it's mostly a food historian's curiosity, a relic of the era when cold cuts meant something very literal. You probably won't find this one at your local deli, but it did once sit proudly on middle-class tables across America. Tomato soup cake, the dessert no one saw coming. Would you eat a cake made with canned tomato soup? Sounds like a kitchen disaster, right? But back in 1930s and 40s, tomato soup cake wasn't just accepted, it was beloved. And yes, it really started with a can of Campbell's. This surprisingly sweet spice cake was born during the Great Depression when eggs, butter, and milk were either too expensive or simply unavailable. But resourceful homemakers found a workaround in the most unlikely pantry item, tomato soup. The soup acted as a moisture agent and binder, standing in for dairy and eggs, while its flavor, surprisingly, melted into the background. The result? A rich, moist cake with warm notes of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. Many compared it to carrot cake or spice cake, but with a denser, almost mysterious taste that guests couldn't quite place. Some versions even added raisins or nuts, and if the family was feeling fancy, a thick layer of cream cheese frosting on top. But this wasn't just a Depression-era fluke. In the 1950s, Campbell's leaned into the trend, printing tomato soup cake recipes on their soup labels and promotional cookbooks. It was a clever marketing move, and it worked. Generations of American children grew up eating tomato soup without even realizing it. And yet, somewhere along the way, the tomato soup cake disappeared. Maybe it was the name, maybe it was the era, but this once celebrated dessert faded into obscurity, preserved only in yellowed recipe cards and the memories of those who grew up with it. Peanut butter stuffed onions, the recipe that made America gasp. Just when you thought vintage American food couldn't get any stranger, along came peanut butter stuffed onions, a real dish served at dinner tables during the 1930s and into the war years. This isn't a joke. This was survival cooking at its boldest. In a time when meat was scarce and expensive, especially during World War II rationing, families had to get creative with whatever they had. Onions? Cheap, filling, and available year-round. Peanut butter? High in protein, shelf-stable, and surprisingly versatile. So, the thrifty minds of the era put the two together. The preparation was as simple as it was shocking. Large onions were hollowed out, lightly parboiled, and filled with a generous dollop of peanut butter, sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs or oats. Then they were baked until soft and served as a meat substitute. Some recipes even suggested a drizzle of tomato sauce on top to brighten the flavor. The taste? Let's just say it was divisive. Some families embraced it as an oddball favorite. Others swore it off forever. But for those living through the Great Depression or wartime shortages, it wasn't about flavor. It was about nutrition, filling bellies, and making do with what you had. This dish became a symbol of American grit, a reminder of how far people were willing to go to put something warm on the table. And while it may sound bizarre today, for many, it was just another Tuesday night. Coming up next, a dish that jiggled its way into cookbooks and nightmares, the cabbage jelly ring. You won't want to miss part 6. Cabbage jelly ring, the jiggly side dish that haunted the 50s. If there's one dish that perfectly captures the strange beauty of mid-century American cooking, it's the cabbage jelly ring. Popularized in the late 1940s and 50s, this recipe appeared in glossy cookbooks with pride, often pictured next to a roast ham or a cheerful pitcher of iced tea. But don't let the cheerful presentation fool you. This was one of the most bizarre culinary inventions ever to grace a Sunday table. At its core, the cabbage jelly ring was a savory gelatin mold, a shimmering wheel made from lemon or lime Jell-O, blended with shredded cabbage, grated carrots, pimentos, vinegar, and sometimes even crushed pineapple. It was chilled in a bundt or ring mold until firm, and then served cold, often on a bed of lettuce with a dollop of mayonnaise in the center. Why? Because in the mid-century mindset, gelatin wasn't just for dessert. It was a symbol of modernity. Housewives were encouraged to mold everything, salads, entrees, leftovers, into sculpted shapes that could impress dinner guests and stretch groceries further. Cabbage was cheap. Jell-O was trendy. Put them together, and you had a dish that felt fancy while using humble ingredients. But let's be honest, not everyone loved it. The texture was slippery. The flavors were confusing. And children across America quietly prayed it wouldn't show up on their plate. Still, the cabbage jelly ring became a staple of potlucks and luncheons, until taste shifted and gelatin went back to being sweet. Up next in part 7, a creamy casserole made without a drop of dairy. Can you guess what they used instead? Stick around. The answer will surprise you. Tuna noodle casserole with potato chips, the creamy classic without cream. Now here's a dish that defined an era, tuna noodle casserole, but not the rich, creamy version we know today. No, this Depression-born recipe used no milk, no cream, and sometimes not even cheese. Just pantry staples, clever substitutions, and a whole lot of crushed potato chips on top. During the 1930s and into the rationed years of World War II, fresh dairy was often a luxury. So home cooks had to get creative. This version of tuna noodle casserole skipped the cream entirely, using a simple white sauce made from water, flour, and a bit of margarine, or even just condensed soup thinned with water. The tuna? Usually canned. The noodles? Broken spaghetti or elbow macaroni. To make it feel fancy, homemakers would sprinkle crumbled potato chips or stale breadcrumbs on top for crunch, a clever trick to disguise how little was inside. And the result? A hot, bubbling dish that fed a whole family on pennies. For many kids growing up in the 1940s and 50s, this was the ultimate comfort food. It smelled like home. It looked like a treat. But it was really a masterclass in survival cooking, using what you had and stretching it to the last bite. Even without cream or cheese, the flavor had heart. And the crispy topping? That was the crown jewel. Today, this stripped-down version has been mostly forgotten, replaced by richer modern spins. But in its day, this casserole didn't just feed the family. It gave hope on the hardest nights. Coming up next in Part 8, what happens when spaghetti meets pancakes? The bizarre but beloved dish that turned leftovers into legends. Spaghetti pancakes. Leftovers reborn on a griddle. What do you do when yesterday's spaghetti is cold, clumped, and there's not enough sauce left to revive it? If you were cooking in post-war America, you didn't toss it. You fried it into pancakes. Spaghetti pancakes might sound strange today, but for many frugal families of the 1940s and 50s, this was a brilliant way to stretch leftovers and squeeze one more meal from a pot of pasta. The recipe was simple but ingenious. Take cold spaghetti, usually with a bit of tomato sauce still clinging to it. Crack in an egg, add some breadcrumbs or flour to bind it, and fry the mixture in a skillet until golden and crispy on both sides. The result? A savory, crunchy-edged pancake that was surprisingly satisfying. In Italian-American homes, this trick was passed down like a secret, a way to respect every noodle, especially when food waste was unthinkable. It wasn't just about saving money. It was about honoring the work that went into every meal, every ingredient. Some variations added grated cheese or chopped salami if there was any on hand. Others relied purely on pantry staples. But no matter how humble, spaghetti pancakes were a hit, especially with kids. Crispy on the outside, warm and chewy inside. They were comfort disguised as invention. Today, this forgotten dish lives on in rare family cookbooks or whispered memories from grandparents. It's a reminder that sometimes the most creative meals come from the bottom of the fridge and the back of the pantry. Up next in Part 9, the dessert that shocked America by swapping sugar for sauerkraut. Yes, sauerkraut. Stay tuned. Sauerkraut cake, the dessert that dared to be different. What if I told you that one of the richest, moistest chocolate cakes from the 1950s hid a pile of sauerkraut in its batter? Yes, sauerkraut. The same tangy cabbage side dish served with sausages and hot dogs, baked into chocolate cake. This was Sauerkraut Cake, a real and surprisingly beloved dessert from mid-century America. It sounds like culinary sabotage, but behind the bizarre pairing was pure Depression-era and post-war ingenuity. At the time, ingredients like eggs, oil, and butter were expensive or rationed. But sauerkraut? It was cheap, available, and, believe it or not, incredibly effective. When finely chopped and folded in a chocolate batter, the cabbage melted away into the cake, leaving behind no trace of flavor, only incredible moisture and texture. Home bakers discovered that this oddball ingredient kept cakes from drying out, even after days on the counter. And thanks to the kraut's fermentation, it added a subtle richness that deepened the chocolate without overpowering it. It became a recipe passed between neighbors, clipped from local newspapers and scribbled into church cookbooks. Some versions even included a cream cheese frosting, creating a wild contrast between tangy filling and sweet topping. And for decades it worked. Guests were floored when told what they'd eaten. "No way there's cabbage in this," became the most common response, always followed by a second slice. Sauerkraut cake is proof that forgotten food isn't always about frugality. Sometimes it's about taking risks. Bold, unexpected ones. Coming up next in part 10, a casserole so odd it involved canned peaches, cheese, and elbow macaroni, all baked into one unforgettable dish. Peach and cheese macaroni bake, the sweet-savory clash no one saw coming. Imagine pulling a bubbling casserole from the oven, golden macaroni on top, melted cheddar oozing through and nestled between the layers. Juicy, syrupy canned peaches. Welcome to one of the most bewildering recipes to ever grace a mid-century American dinner table, the peach and cheese macaroni bake. This wasn't a prank. It was published in community cookbooks, printed in homemaker magazines, and even recommended as a balanced family dinner. Why? Because post-war America was obsessed with food innovation, and the wilder, the better. Canned goods had flooded grocery store shelves after World War II. Peaches were sweet, affordable, and available year-round. Cheese added protein. And macaroni? It was cheap, filling, and already a pantry staple. Combine the three, and you had a dish that was economical, comforting, and strange enough to get people talking. The recipe called for elbow macaroni, cooked until tender, layered with shredded cheddar cheese, and topped with sliced canned peaches, syrup, and all. Sometimes, breadcrumbs were sprinkled on top for a crispy finish. The result? A casserole that confused the palate. Creamy, tangy, sweet, and salty all at once. Some swore it was genius. Others were horrified. But in homes where stretching the grocery budget mattered more than culinary logic, this dish held its ground, especially during the 1950s and 60s. And today, it's all but disappeared, relegated to the dusty corners of old recipe cards and yellowed cookbooks. But once upon a time, this peachy pasta casserole was served with pride, a symbol of how far a creative cook could go with just 3 ingredients. Coming up next, a vintage dish that used grape jelly and mustard to turn cocktail meatballs into a legendary party food. Stay tuned.